This is the RAZER Deathadder V4 Pro, Razer's long-awaited refresh of their legendary ergo shape, and a coming-of-age for Razer so to speak, as this is one of, if not the best iterations of the Deathadder ever released, featuring significant improvements across the board, but most notably in terms of its internal tech and performance. I see this mouse as a statement piece of sorts for Razer, as competition in the peripheral space has become rather stagnant as of late, and it's gotten to the point where many reviewers are saying that every gaming mouse is good, and there's no particular brand with a crown for being the best. But with the release of the Deathadder V4 Pro, Razer is making a statement and cementing themselves as the king of ergonomic mice yet again, reclaiming their long-lost crown. Now, I do have a long history with the Deathadder series, as the V3 Wire, despite its many flaws, is one of my favorite mice of all time, and it's still in my rotation despite being over 2 years old, and after several years of the Deathadder series stagnating, having an updated Deathadder with such amazing performance, build quality, click feel, battery life, and a lighter weight is a dream come true for me. I know I might sound like I'm glazing this mouse a little excessively here, but trust me when I say this mouse lives up to the hype I'm giving it. So as always in today's episode of the mel0n Review, we're going to talk in depth all about the improvements, features, and aspects of the Deathadder V4 Pro, as well as its pros and cons. But before we get into it, a big thank you to Razer for sending over the Deathadder V4 Pro early for review, and if you enjoyed this in-depth review and want to see more Razer mice covered here on the channel in the future, including a full teardown guide for the Deathadder V4 Pro and its dongle, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And if you enjoy the review and want to support what I do here on the channel, consider becoming a channel member, as that is not only the best way to directly support what I do here on the channel members also get early access to all upcoming episodes of the mel0n Review and teardown, so if you want to see more content before anyone else and support what I do here on the channel, consider becoming a member today. And it goes without saying, as always, regardless of who provides a review unit or my history with a particular mouse, my opinions of our product have always and will always be unbiased. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I used the Deathadder V4 Pro for approximately 2 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming use. For skates, since the mouse uses the same fantastic designed stock skates as we saw on the Viper V3 Pro, I only used the stock skates throughout my testing, as they were so good I didn't feel the need to use any aftermarket skates. For sensitivity and pad types used, I used my usual ranges of 40cm per 360 for fabric pads and 50cm per 360 for hard pads. For firmware, I tested the Deathadder on its latest 1.20.0.0 firmware, and I also used a -6° tilt on the sensor as it matched my tilted grip perfectly. And for games tested, I tested the Deathadder V4 Pro in Kovacs, Splitgate 2, Valorant, RoboQuest, and a couple other FPS games. For pricing and versions, the Deathadder V4 Pro retails for $169.99 USD, or around 235 Canadian dollars, slightly more than the Viper V3 Pro's retail price. Currently, at launch, the V4 is only available in the standard black and white colorways. However, just as we saw with the Deathadder V3 Pro and the Viper V3 Pro, I assume we'll probably see some special editions released in the near future, which will most likely retail for slightly more than the current retail price. And for today's video, I'll be covering the Deathadder V4 Pro in the black colorway. For unboxing, the Deathadder V4 Pro comes in a larger box compared to the Viper V3 and Deathadder V3, but despite its size, the packaging is still made out of recycled materials and printed with soy ink, same as the aforementioned mice's packaging. It's also worth noting that even the plastics inside the packaging are made out of approximately 30% post-consumer materials, which is a great attention to detail from Team Green. Now, the packaging itself features Razer's familiar style, which not only provides a good breakdown of the mouse's specifications and features, but also clearly shows what's included with the mouse, which is quite helpful. Opening the box is quite easy, as you can simply pull the top off the base, and inside you'll find the Deathadder V4 Pro itself and its new Hyperspeed wireless Gen 2 dongle, both of which are resting in a large cardboard holder. Now, the Deathadder itself comes with full-size PTFE skates pre-installed, as we've traditionally seen, and there is a plastic sheet over its base which you will need to remove prior to use. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these skates are the same type as the fantastic ones on the Viper V3 Pro, just slightly smaller in their surface area and cut much better to fit the mouse's skate channels. This is a significant improvement over the Viper V3 Pro's stock skates, at least in terms of their shaping, and we'll talk more in depth about the performance later in this video. The new Hyperspeed Dongle also has a plastic cover over its base, so be sure to remove that as well. Now this dongle is distinctly different from not only Razer's previous dongles, but pretty much every other dongle on the market, and it's packed with a bunch of new features which we'll talk more about in a moment. Now under the cardboard holder for the mouse and the dongle, you'll find the rest of the Deathadder's accessories, the first of which is a USB A to C cable, which just like the Viper V3 Pro's stock cable, comes with protective covers for both ends and a rubber cable wrapper. Unfortunately, similar to the aforementioned cable, this cable is rather rigid with a semi-rough paracord wrapping, and it lacks a tilted USB-C end, which is quite disappointing. As I said in my Viper V3 Pro review, this style of cable significantly impacted that mouse's wired experience, and sadly it does the same here on the Deathadder, but we'll talk more about this cable and its negative impacts and how it can be improved later in this video. Under the cable we'll find a letter from Razer's CEO, and on the opposite side of the letter there is a quick breakdown of the new features of the Hyperspeed Gen 2 dongle, which again we'll talk about in a moment, and below that we have a user manual, which is the same fancier design that we saw in the Viper V3 Pro, but despite its fanciness, the manual does provide a thorough breakdown of the mouse's specifications, buttons, and how to set up the mouse and connect it to Synapse. Under the manual there is also a set of Razer stickers, which are also made of the same 30% post-consumer material as the other plastics included in the packaging, and a set of grip tape, which unfortunately is identical to the ones included with the Viper V3 Pro, just cut differently to match the Deathadder's larger shell. And sadly, since they're the same type as we saw with the Viper, these grips are quite underwhelming in terms of their performance, as they've historically been with all of Razer's mice, and we'll talk more about why they're not good and how they can be improved later. And lastly, for warranty, the Deathadder V4 Pro has a 2-year warranty, the same you'll find on most of Razer's peripherals. But overall, the unboxing experience here for the Deathadder V4 Pro is good, very similar to the Viper V3 Pro's unboxing experience. However, the mouse's stock cable is still very disappointing, as are the stock grips, and while the stock skates are excellent, the mouse only includes the pre-installed set, not any extras. I did have hopes for some improvement to some accessories coming from the Viper V3 Pro, but it looks like we'll have to wait a little longer for Razer to make some additional changes and improve their unboxing experience and their accessories. Now before I move on to talk about in-game performance and the other aspects of this mouse, I wanted to talk more in depth about the new Hyperspeed Dongle, as it's a massive improvement over Razer's previous dongles and most dongles you'll find on the market. Now instead of the traditional dongle shape, the dongle here has a hemispheric design with a large rubber base and a standard USB-C port and 3 indicator LEDs on its front. Now despite its unique shaping, another odd feature to this dongle is that unlike most dongles which are very light, this dongle is extremely heavy, feeling more like a paperweight than a mouse dongle, as it weighs around 45 grams. This is actually a great feature, as lighter dongles, such as the Viper V3 Pro's dongle, are so light cables can pull them off desktops quite easily, but the Hyperspeed dongle's heavy weight in combination with its large rubber base anchors the dongle extremely strongly to most desktop surfaces. Now weight aside, the other biggest feature to this new Hyperspeed dongle is the aforementioned indicator LEDs. Now referencing the info sheet we unboxed a moment ago, we can see that these lights reflect several status features on the mouse, including the mouse's polling rate, battery level, and most importantly, the mouse's connectivity status and quality. Inside Synapse, you can also change what these LEDs actually reflect, change their ordering, or disable them entirely, which is another great attention to detail, and we'll talk more about the customization options for the dongle later in this video. Now, we've seen other dongles show battery and DPI statuses with their LEDs before, but an indication for the mouse's connectivity strength and quality is a new feature I've never seen before, and it actually works too, as if you place the dongle next to a router or move the mouse super far away from the dongle, the indicator LED will change to reflect the connectivity status and quality, which is a really cool feature. Now this feature, while not being the most applicable for home use, is very useful for LAN or tournament use cases, as these environments have a lot of signal interference from wireless lights, mics, and other peripherals, all of which use similar bandwidths, and can cause a lot of signal interference with peripherals in some cases. devices. But now with the updated Hyperspeed dongle, in this environment you can check the connection quality before and as you're playing to ensure there's no interference impacts on your mouse's connection and performance. And speaking of signal and interference, the new dongle design also features an improved antenna architecture which further improves the dongle's transmission and reception strength, and it also makes it more resistant to interference, which is further aided by the Gen 2 Hyperspeed wireless tech used by the Deathadder V4 Pro, and we'll talk more in depth about this and the dongle's upgraded antenna later in this video. But while we're talking about the dongle, I wanted to note that this new dongle isn't backwards compatible with Razer's other products such as keyboards and headsets, which previously you could unify to one receiver. Now I assume Razer will add support for this unifying connection in the future, but as of now this updated dongle is only compatible with the Deathadder V4 Pro, so keep this in mind if you have other Razer products and you use the unifying receiver feature before. Also, one other dongle related feature I wanted to highlight is that the outer surface of the hemispherical dongle is covered in the same coating that's on the Deathadder, so despite its more rounded shape, it's actually very grippy and very easy to pick up, which is a great little attention to detail as dongles often don't have any kind of coating on them, and a dongle with this shape with no coating could be kind of difficult to pick up in some situations. And lastly, since I'm going to be making a teardown video for the Deathadder V4 Pro, I might as well make a teardown guide for the dongle as well, so if you want to see both the mouse and the dongle's internals and how they're designed, be sure to get subscribed. For in-game performance, I really enjoyed the feel of the Deathadder V4 Pro, which isn't exactly surprising as I've been using the Deathadder shape for several years now, but despite the familiar shape, the performance and usage experience here on the V4 is vastly improved from the previous versions due to all the technical improvements Razer has made. The biggest of which in my opinion is the dual wired and wireless AK polling support. This feature was unfortunately absent from the Viper V3 Pro and the Deathadder V3 Pro, but it's exceptionally well implemented here, so not only do you have the fantastic wireless connectivity that was found in the Viper V3 Pro, which has also been improved, and we'll discuss those improvements later, you also have the amazing wired connectivity we saw in the Deathadder V3, which has also been improved, and combined, the dual AK gives the V4 essentially flawless performance across the board on either connectivity type, though I would recommend using a lighter, more flexible aftermarket cable for the best experience on the wired connectivity, as the stock cable is rather stiff as I talked about earlier. Another notable improvement here is the mouse's buttons, all of which are improved from both the previous Deathadders and the Viper V3 Pros, specifically when it comes to the main click switches, as the V4 Pro uses Razer's Gen 4 optical switches, which have been redesigned from the ground up by Razer. These are a massive improvement over the Gen 3 switches, and not only in terms of performance but also click feel, and thankfully the main clicks lack that spongy feeling to them we saw in the Viper V3 Pro's main clicks, as instead they have a more traditional crisp, snappy click feel with vastly improved audio feedback as well, and we'll talk more in depth about these new switches and all their features later in this video. On the topic of buttons, I also wanted to mention there have been some improvements made to the scroll wheel as well it does have the same shaping and texturing as the previous Deathadder scroll wheels. The encoder has been updated, as the Deathadder is using an optical scroll wheel encoder instead of the mechanical ones we saw in their previous mice, which were prone to some issues to say the least, and this new encoder, while being a little loose for my taste, does perform very well and is much more reliable than the previous mechanical coders Razer has used, and we'll talk more about this new scroll wheel encoder later in this video. I'd also be remiss not to mention the mouse's stock skates, which are the same type seen on the Viper V3 Pro, which I'm very happy about as those stock skates were very impressive, and the same goes for the one here on the Deathadder as they performed exceptionally well. However, due to their smaller surface area, they are faster than the Viper V3 Pro stock skates but slower than the original Deathadder V3 stock skates, but again they performed exceptionally well for stock skates and we'll talk more about them later in this video. And yet another significant under the hood improvement is that the Deathadder uses a brand new sensor and MCU, as the mouse is using the brand new Focus Pro Gen 2 45K sensor, which is an improvement over the previous gen Razer sensors, but the biggest star in my opinion here is the updated MCU, as this new SoC is significantly more power efficient than the typical Nordic 52840 MCUs Razer has used before, which gives the Deathadder the best battery life I've ever seen on a mouse to date, and it also significantly improves the mouse's connectivity, latency, and power efficiency, which is a fantastic improvement, and we'll talk more about this new sensor and MCU later in this video. I'm also very happy to report that all the fantastic software features that we saw in the Viper V3 Pro are present here in the Deathadder, such as the sensitivity matcher tool, dynamic sensitivity, sensor rotation, and more, and these features further add to the fantastic user experience here on the Deathadder. But that said, sadly the mouse still does use the very bloated Synapse 4, but that is to be expected for a Razer mouse. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I do prefer ergonomic mice, so I suppose I have some bias towards mice like the Deathadder, as its shape is ideal for my hand size, but grip compatibility aside, I can't deny the fact that throughout my testing the mouse performed perfectly, even better than the Viper V3 Pro did in many situations. And in every game I tested the Deathadder V4 Pro in, the mouse's usage experience and performance was flawless in every way, which is something I rarely say about mouse nowadays, and something I never thought I'd say about a Razer mouse, but here we are. Oh, also, I normally don't talk about dongles when I go over in-game performance, but the Hyperspeed Gen 2 dongle is a great feature, and I really hope we see Razer use it on their future releases, as not only does it perform great, but the customizable LED indicators are a very useful feature. Now, before we talk about the Deathadder's build quality and QC, as a quick disclaimer, my unit was sent to me directly by Razer, so take the build quality and QC of my unit with a grain of salt, as it is a pre-release unit and not a retail unit. But that said, for build quality, just as we saw in the Deathadder V3 and the Viper V3 Pro, the mouse's build quality is very impressive, and even though the V4 shell is made of 90% post-consumer recycled materials, which are traditionally heavier and weaker than standard ABS plastics, just like the Viper V3 Pro, the V4 shells, despite its material, is extremely rigid, with no creaking or flexing anywhere across the shell. This is mainly due to the internal design, as it's using a central cage-like design similar to the Viper V3 Pro's internal cage, which does wonders in terms of keeping the shell rigid, and uniquely, the top and base shells also use these peg-like connectors along their sides, which in combination with the traditional clips keeps the upper and base shells perfectly anchored and free from any flexing and creaking, as I mentioned earlier. And in terms of QC, unsurprisingly, the mouse feels perfect out of the box, and both the main clicks feel great, and due to their new switches, they have a much better click feel and sound to them than the Viper V3 Pro's main buttons, as I mentioned earlier. The side buttons also feel great, similar in their feeling to the V3 Pro's side buttons, and the scroll wheel is also notably improved due to the new encoder, as I just mentioned. And over my testing, the mouse's buttons stayed consistent in their feeling, and I didn't run into any mechanical or technical issues with the Deathadder V4 Pro. It's also worth mentioning that the internal build quality and QC is perfect on my unit. As it turns out, the mouse is actually easier to service than the Viper V3 Pro was, but unfortunately the top shell buttons are still anchored into the top shell, so they are not user serviceable. But on the plus side, the other internal components of the Deathadder are very easy to service, much easier than they were before, specifically the battery, and we'll talk more about the Deathadder's repairability later in this video. Now, in terms of weight, Razer is advertising the Deathadder will weigh approximately 56 to 57 grams, which is a roughly 10% weight reduction from the Deathadder V3 Pro. However, just as we saw with the Viper V3 Pro, the weight specification of the Deathadder will differ depending on the colorway you purchase, as the black V4 will weigh 56 grams and the white, due to the coloring, is advertised at 57 grams, which is a rather impressive weight spec for both of these mice considering their larger size. But as usual for a Razer mouse, there is no plus-minus gram ratio on the advertised weight specs, which is a welcome change from other brands who advertise their mouses weighing 40 grams, but with a plus-minus 3 gram ratio, making the mouse's true weight 43 grams or more. Now for my unit, my Deathadder V4 Pro in the black colorway with the stock skates installed weighs exactly 56.2 grams, which is technically outside the advertised 56 gram weight spec, but this isn't particularly surprising, as the Viper V3 Pro White, which was advertised as weighing 55 grams, in reality weighed 55.3 grams, and given that it was only 0.3 grams over the advertised weight spec and the Deathadder is only 0.2, I'm going to give Razer a pass here, as the mouse is barely outside its advertised weight specifications. Also, on the topic of weight, if you use the included grip tape, it will add an additional 2.7 grams to the Deathadder's overall weight, but since the mouse's stock coating is so good and the grips themselves are quite underwhelming, I doubt you'll need or want to use them, but even if you use them or aftermarket grip tapes, they'll only add a couple grams to the Deathadder V4 Pro's overall weight. For balancing, the Deathadder V4 Pro, as expected for this series of mouse, is uniquely balanced, as just like the previous versions, the V4 Pro is balanced forward of the mouse's physical midline, centered around the gap between the two side buttons, resting approximately 4.5mm forward of the mouse's physical midline. But unlike the balancing range we saw in the Viper V3 Pro, the balancing here on the Deathadder is much thinner, being more akin to a traditional balancing point rather than a range. But despite the forward balancing point, point. In the hand, the Deathadder feels very well balanced on its x-axis, with no noticeable forward or rear heaviness. However, if you use the mouse wired, since the stock cable is a more rigid, heavier type, it does make the mouse ever so slightly forward heavy. And for y-axis balancing, surprisingly for an ergo mouse, it is very well balanced, which is something we don't often see, so props to Razer for balancing the V4 Pro so well. In terms of shape, unsurprisingly, the Deathadder is an ergonomic mouse, shocker I know, having the exact same shape as the previous Deathadder V3 and V3 Pros. It is also right-hand optimized as expected, so unlike some symmetrical or asymmetrical or hybrid shapes, the Deathadder cannot be used if you are left-handed, but hopefully we'll see Razer make a left-handed version of the Deathadder in the future. For specific dimensions, the V4 Pro measures approximately 128.0mm long. For widths, at the shell's front region, at its base it measures approximately 63.3mm wide, and at its peak it measures around 67mm wide. At the shell's mid region, at the base it measures approximately 59.6mm wide, and at its peak it measures approximately 61.1mm wide. And at the shell's end region, at its base it measures approximately 66mm wide, but Razer is advertising that it actually measures 68mm wide. Now I'm not sure if this is a typo, but my shell, at least from my measurements, is slightly thinner than Razer's specifications here. For heights, measured at the middle of the shell on its x-axis, at the front region the shell is approximately 21.4mm tall, at the middle region the shell measures approximately 41.1mm tall, and at the end region the shell tapers down to be approximately 5mm tall at its termination point. But to clarify these height measurements, since this is an ergonomic shell, these measurements represent the centered heights of the Deathadder V4's shell, and the left and right sides of said measurements will be taller or shorter, as for example at the shell's mid region, the left side is approximately 43mm tall and the right side is approximately 26.1mm tall, so keep this in mind as my measurements differ from Razer's dimensional specifications in some regards due to the ergonomic shape. For the Deathadder V4 Pro shell profiles, looking from the mouse's top we can see that tried and true Deathadder shape with the expected tilted forward to mid region and the rounded end region. Flipping the mouse over we can clearly see the aforementioned ergonomic shape with the expected slight hourglass-like curvature on the left side, right from the top, and the flatter, more outwardly angled right side, left from the top. We can also see that there's a significant difference between the base's width and the top shell's width, hence the differences I just mentioned. From the sides we can best see the mouse's hump profile, which is the expected traditional ergonomic shaping, having a taller, less curved forward region and the shorter, gradually declining rear region. And as I mentioned earlier, we can also see here the differing heights on the left and right sides due to the shell's aggressive ergonomic tilt. From the front, we can best see the mouse's front profile with its taller, less aggressively curved forward profile, and we can also best see the aforementioned aggressive ergonomic tilt, which is tilted at the same angle as the previous iterations of the Deathadder. Also from the front, we can best see the mouse's side shell profiles, which as expected for an ergonomic mouse are quite different from each other, as the mouse's left side shell, right from the front, is slightly outwardly tilted and mostly flat aside from a slight curve at its base, and the side shell maintains its shape profile as it travels towards the mid region of the shell where the hourglass-like curvature terminates, and continues to have a similar profile until the end region where it becomes inwardly tilted to match the rear shell's curvature, whereas the right side shell, left from the front, is also outwardly tilted and has a slight curvature at its top region in addition to its base curvature, but as it travels towards the mid region it suddenly inverts to be very outwardly tilted, and this continues until the end region where it reverts to its inwardly tilted profile, just more aggressively tilted to match the mouse's rear shell profile, just as the opposite side did. It's also worth noting that just like the Deathadder V3 and Viper V3 Pro, the foremost region of the right side's profile has the same ring finger-like ridge to it, hence the more aggressive curvature we just talked about. And lastly, from the rear, we can again see the shell's aggressive ergonomic tilt, which peaks towards the mouse's left side, and we can also see the rear shell's curvature, which is largely flattened with the exception of the ergonomic tilt, somewhat similar to the rear shell curvature of the Viper V3 Pro, just a little taller and of course tilted due to the ergonomic nature of the Deathadder shell. For contact areas and points for my 1905 by 12.7cm hands using a tilted palm claw hybrid grip here on the Deathadder V4 Pro. Starting with palm contact, the primary anchoring point for my hand is the left side of my mid palm as it makes direct contact with the peak of the tilted top shell. My thenar region also makes direct contact in its mid to upper region with the left side of the tilted top shell, as well as on the left side shell's flared curvature. And lastly, my hypothenar also makes contact in its mid to upper region with the bottom right section of the rear hump's rounded rear profile. For finger contact points, my thumb naturally rests at the left side shell's upper region, but I can also angle my thumb inward to rest it at the deepest point of the left side shell's slight hourglass-like indentation if needed. For my index and middle fingers, they naturally rest towards the top region of the main clicks, sitting at the button's centers as the button's slight grooves guides them there. For my ring finger, it also naturally rests towards the forward region of the right side shell, just slightly lower than my thumb does on the opposite side. And lastly, my pinky finger rests lower than my ring finger, resting around the midpoint of the right side shell profile, just at the peak of the right side's rounded shell flare to match its rounded rear curvature. Now, in terms of the estimated hand size and grip compatibility here for the Deathadder V4 Pro, RAZER themselves is advertising that the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips, which given the mouse's ergonomic nature and larger size is expected, but as always depending on your hand size, the grip compatibility for the mouse will change a little bit. From my estimations, for small hands roughly measuring 11.7 by 7.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips, but the mouse might be too big to utilize with this hand size due to its larger shell. For small to medium hands measuring approximately 13.5 by 9 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm grips, but again this hand size might also be too small to utilize the mouse properly. For medium sized hands measuring approximately 15 by 10 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips, maybe claw grips depending on your hand size. For medium to large hands measuring approximately 16 by 11 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm and claw grips. For large hands measuring approximately 17 by 12 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm, claw, and fingertip grips. And lastly, for extra large hands measuring approximately 19 by 13 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm, claw, hybrid grips, claw grips, and fingertip grips. But as always, keep in mind these are rough estimations, and the actual hand size and grip style compatibility for the mouse will vary from person to person. And also keep in mind that while I did list fingertip grip as being compatible here for the Deathadder, because the mouse's weight and its larger ergonomic size, even though you can fingertip grip the mouse is much better suited for palm and claw grips. Now for coding, as expected for a RAZER mouse, its coding performs exceptionally well, but just like we saw in the Viper V3 Pro, the coding here feels a little different from the ones RAZER has previously used. Now compared to the original Deathadder V3's coding, the V4's coding feels much chalkier and less rubberized, but just as if not slightly grippier. Compared to the Viper V3 Pro's white coating, the V4's coding feels the closest to it, but the V4's coding still is a little chalkier in its feeling, but it feels on par with the Viper's coding in terms of gripability. Now RAZER didn't state that they made any changes to the coating on the Deathadder V4, and since there is usually a slight difference between the white and black coatings, I'm going to assume that the Deathadder V4 series is using the same coatings as the Viper V3 Pro used, which means that the white coating will have that more rubberized, slightly chalky feel to it, while the black coating will have more of a chalky and less rubberized feel to it. But as I just mentioned, both coatings feel the same in terms of gripability, and even though I have very sweaty hands, I was able to keep a consistent, well-anchored grip on the Deathadder V4 Pro's shell over my testing, just as I was able to do on the Viper V3 Pro's white coating. All that said, just as we saw in the Viper V3 Pro's special editions, if future versions of the Deathadder V4 Pro are released with special colorways such as a Gengar edition, there might be further difference in the coating's feel, but its performance will stay the same. Now before we move on, one last coating related note I wanted to make is that if you purchase the black colorway of the V4 Pro, keep in mind that since the coating holds onto dust and debris and the oils from your hand like a magnet does metal, the coating will have a grimy look to it, especially after being used, just like the Deathadder V3's coating did. Now this isn't a bad thing, as this is just a trait of all black colored coatings of this style, and this never impacted the coating's performance, and you can remove this grimy look by wiping the mouse down, but you will have to do this frequently to keep the mouse looking clean. As such, if you're particular about the appearance of your mouse, I'd recommend getting the white colorway of the V4 Pro, as the white coloring doesn't show grime at all, but even on the white colorway, make sure you wipe your mouse mouse off every couple days to keep the coating clean. Also, if you're concerned about the white coating's long-term durability, just as we saw in the white Viper V3 Pro's coating, Razer considers the coating's durability to be so good that tarnishing or degrading of the white or any other of the version's coating is a non-issue, quote-unquote, so I wouldn't be concerned about the coating's long-term durability regardless of the color you get, unlike that other popular mouse's white coating. Next, let's talk about the Deathadder V4 Pro's included grip tape, which, as I mentioned earlier, is quite disappointing, as it is the same type of grips we saw included with the Deathadder V3 Pro and the Viper V3 Pro. Now, on paper, these grips should be fine, as they have that traditional raised diamond-like texturing to them, but the rubber material they're made out of isn't as grippy as you'd expect, as it's actually quite slippery, especially with sweatier hands. The grip shaping also isn't ideal, as while the mouse includes the expected click and side covers, it doesn't include any hump covers or side button covers, and while these pieces are necessary per se, many other brands such as G-Wolves and Wise Owl, for example, include not only better quality grips, but also extra pieces including hump and side button covers. Now, since the Deathadder's coating is so good, I doubt many users will want to use or need to use the included stock grips, but regardless, I would still love to see Razer improve their stock grip tapes by making them thinner and stickier, and also including more pieces such as hump and side button covers, especially considering that many other brands' mice which retail at much lower prices include not only better quality grips but also the aforementioned extra pieces. So in my opinion, Razer should definitely prioritize improving their stock grips, as the ones currently included are an unacceptable quality for such a premium priced mouse in my opinion, and hopefully we'll see Razer improve these grips in the future. Next, let's talk about main clicks, as this is one aspect of the Deathadder V4 that hasn't changed much from the prior versions, at least visually, as the M1 and M2 buttons are the same longer design with a fairly pronounced roundness to them, and with the expected tilted design with differing heights due to the shell's ergonomic tilts. Also carried over from the previous versions is the finger groove in the main clicks, which while they are much less pronounced than the grooves in the Viper V3 Pro's main clicks, they're pronounced enough where they still guide your fingers to the middle of the shell buttons, as I mentioned earlier. Now, this groove is the deepest at the top region of the main clicks and gradually thins out until it terminates at the button's mid region. As such, if you click towards the top to mid region of the buttons, the grooves will guide your fingers fairly well, but at the end region of the shell buttons, since there's no groove there will be no guide for your fingers. And as expected, the main buttons also share the same coating as the rest of the Deathadder's shell, so in addition to the grooves guiding your fingers, the coating helps to keep the shell buttons grippy and keeps your fingers anchored in place, and over my testing, even with my sweatier hands, I didn't have any issues with my fingers slipping or shifting on either of the Deathadder's main clicks. Another great aspect to the main clicks is that just like the Viper V3 Pro and Deathadder V3 Pro's main clicks, they are very well stabilized, with little to no play on either button, even when fully actuated. And since the finger grooves here are much shallower than the ones on Razer's other mice, the buttons don't have that wobble or rocking nearly as much as the Viper V3 Pro's main clicks did, which is great to see. On top of the great stabilization, the Deathadder's main clicks are also indented into the shell, but unlike the Viper's main clicks, which were walled in by the side shell, the indentation here is more of a gap, as the side shell walls don't go as high as they did on the Viper. Now, this was to be expected, as the older Deathadder's main buttons are indented the same way, and despite the lack of walling, the gaps are big enough where both the main clicks are free from most interference issues from your fingers resting against the mouse's side shells, but if you rest your fingers towards the top of the mouse's sides, you can cause some slight interference, but to do this you would have to hold the mouse in a very unnatural manner for this to happen, so this isn't exactly a concern per se, but that said, I still do wish the side shell walling was taller like it was in the Viper, as that would eliminate any, albeit rare, possibility of main click interference here on the Deathadder. For click heights, since the Deathadder is an ergo mouse, the tilt causes the left and right main clicks to have very differing button heights. As such, for the left click, at the top region of the button it measures approximately 24.9mm high, at the mid region, around where the scroll wheel is, it measures approximately 29.3mm tall, and at the end region of the clicks they measure approximately 37mm tall. For the right click, at its top region, it measures approximately 21.4mm tall, at its mid region, again around where the scroll wheel is, it measures approximately 27.6mm tall, and at the end region of the button it measures approximately 34.7mm tall. In terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test for the Deathadder V4 Pro's main clicks. Now, while the button design here on the Deathadder V4 Pro is pretty similar to its previous iterations, where this mouse is very different is the internals. As for the mouse's main click switches, as I mentioned earlier, the Deathadder V4 Pro is using Razer's new Gen 4 optical switches, which are just renamed Raisha switches. Now, these switches have been redesigned from the ground up and are a significant improvement over the switches we've seen on Razer's previous mice, and you can visually see these changes as the new switches have a much thinner, lower profile design, which is noticeably different than the taller, boxier Gen 3 switches. Another improvement to these Gen 4 switches is their durability rating, as they're rated for over 10 million cycles. These new switches also have a much crispier, more traditional pingy sound to them, similar to the Deathadder V3's main clicks, just a little better acoustically speaking. And as I mentioned earlier, the click feel has been vastly improved too, having a much cleaner, snappier actuation feeling, and lacking that sponginess that we found on the Viper V3 Pro's Gen 3 switches, which is a great improvement here on the Deathadder. Now, since these are proprietary Raisha or Razer switches, unfortunately I was unable to get specific specifications on them, so keep in mind that the gram force ratings I'll talk about in a moment are estimations and will likely vary from the switch's actual specs. In terms of actuation weight, this is where we find yet another improvement on these Gen 4 switches, as according to Razer, these switches are 12% lighter than their predecessors, being the Gen 3 switches, due to their new design, physical housing, and thinner internal springs. This gives the Deathadder's new switches a slightly lighter actuation weight, feeling around a 65 to 70 gram force when clicking at their end to mid region, and around 70 to 75 gram force when clicking at their top region. So while the switches are lighter, being more akin to a traditional switch such as an Omron or FE or Wano Blue Shell Pink Dot switch in terms of actual click feel, they still are on the heavier side compared to most switches, which generally sit between the 50 to 60 gram force range. But regardless of their heavier click weight, they are a notable improvement from the Viper V3 Pro and Deathadder V3's main clicks in terms of their feeling. In terms of travel, both main clicks when clicking at the top to mid region have a low range of pre-travel and a medium range of post-travel, but if you click towards the end region of the buttons, the travel ranges will increase slightly as expected. For rebound, due to the new switches, both the main buttons have a very snappy rebound, similar in feeling to the Deathadder V3's main click rebound, just much snappier, so despite their heavier actuation weight, both the main clicks feel very snappy and responsive. And another great feature that is carried over from the previous versions that I did miss when I reviewed the Viper V3 Pro is that the Gen 3 switches were hot swappable, and even though the Razer has fully redesigned these Gen 4 switches, they are also hot swappable as well, which is a great feature I'm very happy to see here on the Deathadder. Now, I will admit, getting to these switches is a little tricky due to the mouse's internal design and construction, and you do need to be very careful when removing the switches as the PCB around them is extremely thin, but regardless, they are user serviceable, so if the switches fail or need to be replaced, replacing them is fairly easy, and we'll talk more about how to access and remove and swap these main click switches in Deathadder V4 Pro's teardown video, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. But while many aspects of the Deathadder V4 Pro's main clicks have been significantly improved, sadly their physical design is the same as we've seen on Razer's previous mice, as the top region of the shell button still has that very pronounced sharp tip to them, and they do stick out slightly from the mouse's front shell. Due to their sharper point, there is a chance that the edge of the clicks could get caught on objects on your desk or inside a bag or carrying case, which can cause the clicks to be damaged. And because of this, I would love to see Razer flatten this sharp edge on the main clicks down, similar to what G-Wolves did on the HTX Mini, to lessen the potential that the main clicks could get caught on something or be damaged. And just like we saw on the Viper V3 Pro, the main shell buttons and the side buttons sadly are not user serviceable, as they are actually physically anchored to the top shell as their standoffs have been melted down. So if any of the mouse's buttons do get damaged, you can't replace them as you could on Razer's older mice. So if you are unfortunate enough to damage one of your side buttons or your main clicks, you'll have to replace the mouse's entire top shell. Now this obviously is intentional, and Razer's logic behind this is that by melting down the standoffs and physically anchoring them to the top shell, the buttons can come loose, which can happen to traditionally anchored clicks over very long-term use, and doing so ensures the clicks remain anchored and consistent in their feeling for essentially the entire lifespan of the mouse. But as I just mentioned, this anchoring does prevent the buttons from being user serviceable, which is disappointing, but given that Razer is one of, if not the biggest peripheral brand in the world, I understand why they did this, as it benefits the mouse's performance long term and also prevents a significant amount of RMAs due to loose buttons. Alright, now that we talked about main buttons, let's talk about side buttons next. As for a Deathadder series mouse, the Deathadder V4 Pro is using the same typical RAZER styled side buttons, but coming from the Deathadder V3 series, there have been several notable improvements here. Firstly, the side buttons themselves have been widened and their curvature is slightly more aggressive than the Deathadder V3's, designed to match the top shell's curvature a little better. They also have a largely flat surface with the expected angled flattened sides, and RAZER has added a gap between the side buttons, similar to how they did in the Viper V3 Pro, which helps to prevent misactuation issues when pressing the buttons on their inner edges, a great quality of life improvement coming from the Deathadder V3's parallel side buttons. And as I mentioned earlier, just as seen on previous Deathadders, the side buttons are positioned roughly even with the mouse's balancing point being centered around 4.5mm forward of the mouse's physical midline, and the side buttons are quite pronounced from the mouse's side shell, which makes them very easy to reach and consistently actuate. And just like the main clicks, the side buttons use the same coating as the rest of the Deathadder's shell, so their larger flattened surface in combination with their positioning and pronouncedness makes the side buttons even easier to grip and consistently actuate. Another notable aspect of the side buttons is that they're very well stabilized, with very little play to either side button even when fully actuated. However, if you click on the far edges of the buttons, you might notice a very slight wobble, but it's so slight it's borderline not even worth mentioning, and this extremely slight wobble never impacted the feeling or the performance of the side buttons. And in terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the Deathadder V4 Pro's side clicks. Inside, we find a familiar switch here for the side buttons, as the Deathadder is using the same Chenfeng MS09.001W.P2B81 switches we saw used for the Viper V3 Pro and Deathadder V3's side buttons, which have the same cycle rating of 3 million actuations. Now, according to Chenfeng's website, these switches have an actuation weight of around 80 plus minus 10 gram force, but the switches here on the Deathadder feel slightly lighter, more akin to a 70 to 75 gram force actuation weight in my opinion, but they are still on the heavier side of the spectrum when it comes to a side button switch. In terms of travel, both the side buttons have a low range of pre-travel and a medium range of post-travel, which gives these buttons a nice tactile feel, more akin to a traditional switch type. And both the side buttons have a great snappy rebound as well, so both the side buttons are still quite spammable despite their heavier actuation weight. But just like we saw with the main clicks, the Deathadder V4 Pro's side buttons are anchored to the top shell just as they were in the Viper V3 Pro, so sadly the side buttons aren't user serviceable. However, since they are anchored, they'll have a consistent click feel over very long-term use. And one last note I wanted to make regarding the side buttons, due to their forward positioning and larger size, despite the taller left side shell region, your thumb might make some contact with the lower edge of the forward side button when gripping the mouse, but due to the button's heavier actuation weight, you can't easily misactuate the buttons, so even though your thumb might make some contact with the forward side button, rest assured you aren't likely to experience any misactuation issues with it. Next, let's talk about yet another aspect of the Deathadder V4 Pro that's been significantly improved, its scroll wheel. Now, the wheel itself hasn't changed much from the previous versions of the Deathadder, having the same rounded rubber wheel with a dotted linear texturing running across it, which just like the previous iterations is very grippy and makes scrolling or scroll wheel clicking the wheel easy and consistent. Another factor that improves the wheel's usability is its pronouncedness, as the wheel protrudes quite a bit from the mouse's top shell, which gives the scroll wheel the usual scroll range. This is a great thing to see, as oftentimes ergo mice's wheels are very shallow, which heavily impacts their usage and scroll range. But while the wheel itself is unchanged here on the Deathadder, the encoder has been significantly changed as I mentioned earlier, as the Deathadder V4 Pro is using RAZER's brand new optical encoder. This, similar in theory to Pulsar's blue encoder, is a generic encoder that's just been branded with the RAZER name. Now, because of this, I was unable to find any specific information for this encoder, as all the identifiers were removed from the encoder's shell, but we can make an educated guess as to who makes this encoder, as the Viper V3 Pro used an almost identical scroll wheel in terms of its height, which was made by TTC, so based on the parts RAZER has used historically, I'm going to assume this is a TTC or maybe even an F-switch 8mm optical encoder, but again, this is just a guess and I could be completely wrong about who the manufacturer is. But regardless of the manufacturer, this new encoder is a significant improvement over the mechanical encoders RAZER has used before, as mechanical encoders over long-term use are rather prone to wear, causing misactuations such as ghosting or reverse or inconsistent scrolling, just as we saw in the Viper V3 Pro's mechanical scroll wheel over very long-term use. Now, since this is an optical encoder, the encoder doesn't have physical contact points like a mechanical one has, as it uses a laser to track movements, so generally speaking, this encoder type is much more durable, and Razer is advertising that this encoder has a 3.3 times longer lifespan, but oddly enough, they don't mention what encoder this was compared to, nor what the actual lifespan is time-wise or in cycles, so in reality, it might not be as much of an improvement in terms of lifespan as advertised by Razer, but it will still be an improvement over mechanical coders in terms of performance in most if not all use cases. In terms of scroll force, the Deathadder's wheel feels very similar to the Viper V3 Pro's wheel, just with a lighter actuation weight, which gives the scroll wheel a semi-balanced scroll feeling, but since the new optical encoder doesn't have any of those physical steps that a mechanical one has, the scroll points here are quite weak, which makes scrolling very easy, but almost a little too easy, as it makes scroll wheel clicking rather tricky, as it's very easy to slip and accidentally input a scroll depending on where the scroll wheel you click. Speaking of the scroll wheel click, instead of using the same Chenfeng switch as the Viper V3 Pro, the Deathadder V4 Pro is using a new switch I've never seen before, a TTC branded switch with a cyan shell, which appears to be a sub-SKU of the TTC Dragon Dustproof Micro G169 switch, just with the Dragon branding removed. Now, according to TTC's website, they list that this switch has a 100 million cycle rating and has an actuation weight of 65 ± 5 gram force. However, I've never seen a scroll wheel switch have a higher cycle rating than 5 million, so I assume this version has a much lower cycle rating than advertised, likely being between 3 and 5 million cycles. In terms of actuation weight, the advertised gram force weight for the switch itself is accurate, but due to the taller shell design here on the Deathadder, Razer has implemented a very unique click mechanism here for the scroll wheel switch, where the wheel has a small arm attached to it which is supported by a spring, and when the wheel is clicked, this arm pokes through the top shell's cage-like structure onto the scroll wheel click's plunger. Now, this is something I've never seen before, but I actually really like this design, and while it does increase the switch's actuation weight to more of a 70 to 75 gram force, the spring support gives the wheel the snappiest rebound I've ever seen on a scroll wheel to date, which in combination with the full-size switch's rebound makes the scroll wheel very responsive. This is a great feature here, and props to Razer for the clever engineering, and hopefully we'll see this style of scroll wheel implemented on their future mice, as it feels fantastic to use. But while the scroll wheel click is very well implemented, as I mentioned earlier, since the scroll wheel lacks those mechanical contact points and feels rather loose, scroll wheel clicking towards the forward or rear region of the wheel can result in the wheel wobbling, which occasionally caused accidental scrolling. Because of this, I'd love to see Razer use a bit of a stronger encoder on future versions of the Deathadder just to keep the wheel a little more consistent, but regardless, this slight wobble only accidentally scrolled a handful of times during my testing and didn't significantly impact the mouse's performance. For the Deathadder V4 Pro sensor and MCU, as I mentioned, the mouse is using an updated version of Razer's exclusive Focus Pro sensor, specifically the Focus Pro 45K optical sensor Gen 2, which is codenamed the Razer FP245K SKU. This is an improvement over the previous generation, but not as much of a jump in performance as we saw going from the Focus Pro Gen 1 to the Gen 2, as instead of jumping from a Pixar 3950 SKU to a 3970 SKU, this updated sensor here on the Deathadder appears to still be in the 3970 series SKU, just an altered version to boost some of its specs. For specific specs, the FP245K sensor unsurprisingly has a max DPI of 45,000, 10,000 DPI higher than the FP235K we saw in the Viper V3 Pro. This, like the previous gen sensors, is adjustable via 1 DPI steps, unlike the typical 10 or 50 steps we see on most sensors. The sensor also has an updated IPS inches per second rating of 900, which is an improvement of 150 IPS from the FP235K, and the sensor also has a higher acceleration rating, now being 85 grams, 15 grams higher than the previous gen's rating. And just like we saw in Razer's previous sensors, the FP245K doesn't support angle snapping or ripple, which is again surprising given the max DPI. However, it does have motion sync enabled, but it cannot be disabled on the sensor. For LOD levels, the sensor supports the expected 0.7mm low, 1mm medium, and 2mm high levels we see on all 3950 and 3970 series sensors, but just like the Viper V3 Pro, you can also enable Razer's asymmetrical cutoff feature to change the LOD levels from 3 to 26, which is a great feature for fine-tuning the LOD to your specific aim style. I should also mention that the sensor sensor does support many of the same performance features as the FP235K, including dynamic sensitivity, smart tracking, mouse rotation, and many more, and we'll talk more in depth about these features in this video's software section. But one odd aspect to this sensor is that even though it's technically a new generation, as we just mentioned, all the improvements are mainly DPI acceleration and IPS, and the rest of the sensor's features are the same as the previous gen, hence why I think the FP245K sensor is still a Pixar 3970 series SKU, not a brand new sensor SKU like a 3990 for example. This means that the sensor's tracking capabilities will be the same as the previous FP235K SKUs, including its glass tracking capabilities, and while it is still much better than the 3950 series sensors when it comes to tracking on glass, and supports tracking on 4mm or thinner glass, low LOD values and high polling rates can still cause some tracking issues on glass even on this updated sensor. So just like the FP235K, you will need to use specific settings for the sensor to track properly on glass, which are setting the report rate to 1000 Hz and using medium to high LOD values. And over my testing with the sensor set to these settings, the Deathadder V4 Pro tracked perfectly fine on not only the RAZER Atlas, which I will be reviewing soon, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that review, but also the Glassworks Hana and Kazemi, the Wallhack or Skypad 3.0, and the Lock-on Harut. For positioning, the sensor here is also positioned quite uniquely compared to most mice, just as we've seen on previous iterations of the Deathadder, as it's positioned slightly behind the mouse's physical midline by around 1mm or so, and around 5.5mm behind the mouse's forward balancing point. Now this gives the Deathadder the same controlled feeling as it sits lower in your hand than most sensors with central balancing points, which will take some time to get accustomed to if you've never used a Deathadder before, but if you're coming from another Deathadder like the Deathadder V3, it'll feel exactly the same and performs very well regardless of its unique positioning. And lastly, for MCU we have some big improvements here, as instead of using the standard Nordic 52840 MCU we've seen used on almost every single gaming mouse for the past year, including the Viper V3 Pro, the Deathadder V4 Pro is using a brand new Nordic NRF 54H20 MCU, and the same MCU is being used on the updated Hyperspeed Dongle. While this might seem like a small change, this actually has some pretty significant impacts on the mouse's performance, as not only does this updated MCU significantly improve the mouse's communications, the new SoC is also significantly more power efficient than the previous Nordic MCUs, and we'll talk all about the effects of this new MCU in a moment. Now in terms of connectivity and polling rates here for the Deathadder V4 Pro, before I talk about the polling rates, I want to quickly talk about the mouse's antenna design and its connectivity, as we've seen some further improvements here compared to the Viper V3 Pro and the Deathadder V3 Pro. Now inside the mouse, the antenna is still a separate piece soldered to the mouse's PCB, similar in style to the Viper V3 Pro's antenna, just smaller. This initially seemed kind of odd, as the entire point of adding a physical antenna inside a mouse is to increase its reception range and signal strength, but it turns out RAZER did actually use a larger antenna. It's just not on the mouse, it's inside the new Hyperspeed Dongle. So instead of making a large antenna on the mouse and a smaller one inside the dongle, like the design for the Viper V3 Pro's antenna system, RAZER reversed the system here on the Deathadder V4 Pro. Speaking of which, I also wanted to note that RAZER is making some interesting claims about their new Hyperspeed Gen 2 wireless tech, as they claim it has approximately 37% lower latency than the Gen 1. It's also 63% more power efficient. Now, to be fair, I'm sure RAZER has done some tweaks in their firmware coming from the Gen 1 connectivity, and while their claims are true, these improvements are primarily caused by the new Nordic MCU. As I mentioned in the previous section, this new MCU not only boasts better connectivity and latency, the SoC is significantly more power efficient, hence the improvements RAZER is claiming they offer on their Gen 2 wireless tech. Alright, now that we've talked about the connectivity and the antenna design, let's talk about the mouse's polling rates next, which, as I mentioned earlier in this video, are significantly improved from the previous versions of the Deathadder, as the mouse supports both 125 Hz to 8000 Hz on its wireless 2.4 GHz connectivity and wired USB-C connectivity. So finally, the mouse is no longer capped to 1 kHz on its wired connectivity like it was on the Deathadder V3 Pro and the Viper V3 Pro, and since the V4 Pro features not only an updated sensor and firmware but also a highly efficient MCU, just like the connectivity, the polling rate performance has been significantly improved as well. And over my testing, both the connectivity modes and their respective polling rate implementations were essentially flawless, which is a fantastic improvement as the lack of 8K wired polling on the Viper V3 Pro and the Deathadder V3 Pro was quite disappointing to see, and I'm very happy to finally see dual 8K polling on a Razer mouse. Another thing I also wanted to mention is that just like the Hyperspeed Gen 1 connectivity tech Razer used on the Viper V3 Pro, the Gen 2 connectivity tech here on the Deathadder features many of the same features, most notably including the improved adaptive frequency tech, which actively scans for interference, and if interference is found, the mouse's signal will adapt to avoid it, and the connectivity also continually scans available channels to adapt to use the fastest and lower interference or latency channels during use, further improving the mouse's resistance to interference as well as preventing lag or stuttering on your mouse's connection, which even further improves the mouse's fantastic wireless connectivity on all of its polling rates as if it wasn't good enough already. Next, let's talk about the Deathadder V4 Pro's battery, as there have been some pretty significant improvements here compared to Razer's previous mice. Now again, these improvements are mainly due to the new MCU, but to their credit, Razer has also done a fantastic job optimizing the mouse's power efficiency, and while the box states that the mouse has a 120-hour runtime on 1K Hz, there was a firmware update released shortly after I received my pre-release unit, which further improved the estimated runtime to 150 hours on 1K Hz, and seeing as the Viper V3 Pro surpassed its advertised runtime by quite a significant margin due to its power optimizations, I have a feeling that combined with this new MCU, the runtime for the Deathadder V4 Pro will be even better than advertised here. Now inside the Deathadder is using the same 306 mAh battery we saw inside the Viper V3 Pro, but one notable improvement Razer has made here is they've implemented a pull tab for the battery's adhesive. This is something Apple and many other brands do for cell phone batteries, as you can pull this tab to remove the battery's adhesive from the base shell easily and safely disconnecting the battery. I absolutely love this, as not only does it make replacing the battery in the future incredibly easy, it also makes it much safer, as these little batteries are quite the fire hazard, and if punctured they'll catch fire. So having this pull tab is an amazing improvement, and not having to pry at the battery with tools and risk puncturing it is a great change, and this is something I hope we see Razer use on their future mice, and I'd love to see other brands include similar pull tabs on their batteries to ensure that their batteries are easy and safe to remove as well. Now for estimated runtime, as I just mentioned, Razer is saying that on 1K Hz the mouse will last approximately 150 hours, but since this is a pre-release unit, I didn't have estimates from Razer for 2K or 4K polling, but oddly enough I did have an estimate for 8K polling, as it's rated for approximately 22 hours. Now from my testing with the Deathadder V4 Pro running the 1.20.0.0 firmware, with the mouse's DPI set to its max of 45,000, the auto sleep timer set to 15 minutes, and low power mode set to kick in at 5%, and placed on a mouse jiggler to simulate constant motion, on 1K Hz the Deathadder lasted 196 hours, on 2K Hz it lasted 126 hours, on 4K Hz it lasted 103 hours, and on 8K Hz it lasted a whopping 40 hours. So as expected, the runtime here for the Deathadder is much better than anticipated, just like we saw with the Viper V3 Pro, and it's worth noting that in real world usage the mouse's battery life will be even longer, as these estimates are based off of constant motion. And in just a general use scenario, the mouse won't be constantly moving, and auto sleep will activate to conserve additional battery, further extending the Deathadder's runtime. And as if there weren't more great things to say, another fantastic attention to detail is that even though the mouse's USB channel is deeper than most mice's, it is still universal and compatible with most types of aftermarket cables, which is great to see considering the stock cable is a little underwhelming, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. And lastly, I wanted to mention that there's a very good chance we'll see the Deathadder V4 Pro's runtime improve again in the future, just as we saw with the Viper V3 Pro's constant updates, so be sure to keep your mouse up to date, as future firmware updates will likely increase the mouse's runtime even further. For software, the Deathadder V4 Pro uses the latest version of Synapse, Synapse 4, which is quite different from the previous versions in both good and bad ways, but like the previous versions, however, Synapse 4 is still only available as an installable program. Now, Synapse will still prompt you to create a Razer ID on launch, but thankfully it's not required to use the software, as you can use it without an account. But just as we saw with the Viper V3 Pro, connecting your mouse to Synapse is easy, as all you have to do is launch Synapse, connect your mouse to your PC, and then select the mouse from the device menu listed in Synapse. Inside Synapse, the interface is broken up into multiple tabs. The first is aptly named Customize, which, surprisingly, allows you to customize the mouse's buttons, including the base DPI button, as well as its hypershift binds, but keep in mind to utilize these hypershift keybinds, you will need to rebind one of the mouse's buttons to toggle hypershift. A variety of other rebind options are available here as well, including a bind to a macro, a profile swap, and many more, which is great to see, as many mice for some reason lack profile rebind options. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also customize the new Hyperspeed Dongle's LEDs, and each of these 3 LEDs have 5 different modes they can be set to, all of which are interchangeably set, and you can change it to no light and disable the light entirely, display the battery level, display the connectivity quality, display the polling rate, or display the mouse's DPI stage. Next, in the Performance tab, you can adjust the Deathadder's preset DPI levels, of which there are 5, between 100 and 45,000, or disable them entirely, in which case the mouse will default to 1600 DPI. You can also set different axis DPI values if desired, and you can toggle between these different DPI levels via the software or the base DPI power button on the bottom of the Deathadder. In the next tab, called Sensitivity, you'll find the Sensitivity Matcher, a very useful tool we talked about when I covered the Viper V3 Pro, which you can use to match the sensitivity of another mouse to the Deathadder, whether it's a Razer mouse or not. Now, this is particularly useful as all sensors have some degree of DPI deviation, so being able to match a sensor's field to the Deathadder V4 Pro 1-for-1 is a very useful feature. Next, we have the polling rate options for the Deathadder, where you can select your desired polling rate between wireless and wired 125Hz or 8000Hz, and you can also enable a very useful feature called in-game polling rate, in which Synapse will detect when a game is running and automatically swap the report rate to your desired level. This way, you can set the mouse's normal polling rate to 1K Hz for general use and a higher Hertz for gaming use, in which Synapse will automatically change to this value whenever a full screen game is launched. And lastly, for the Performance tab, you'll find a link to the Windows mouse settings, which is nice as it's always good to check to ensure Windows doesn't randomly re-enable enhanced pointer precision, which if enabled can heavily impact the accuracy of your mouse, so be sure to check to make sure it's disabled. Next, we have the Power tab, where you can adjust the mouse's auto sleep timer for 1 to 15 minutes, and you can also set when the mouse will enter low power mode, and this scale is adjustable from 5% to 100%, but this feature will only work at 1K polling and is disabled if you set the mouse's report rate to 2, 4, 8K Hz. In the next tab, called the Calibration tab, you'll find the Deathadder's LOD liftoff distance settings, where you can set the mouse's LOD to low 0.7mm, medium 1mm, and high 2mm respectively, and as I mentioned earlier, you can also enable the asymmetrical cutoff feature, which brings the total adjustable LOD levels to 26 if desired. And lastly, we have what is arguably the most important tab, the Advanced tab, in which you'll find Razer's dynamic sensitivity setting, which is essentially raw Excel built into Synapse. Now, you can use this feature to increase or decrease your mouse's sensitivity at certain acceleration levels. So for example, movements under 50 grams will stay at 1600 DPI for example, but as soon as your motion goes over 50 grams of acceleration, your mouse's DPI will jump to 3200 or whatever value you want and then return to the default value. Now, while I personally dislike this feature, I know a lot of people do utilize it as it makes performing 180-degree movements much easier, which can be very useful for dodging flashes in Counter-Strike or Valorant, or tracking enemies portaling behind you in Splitgate. However, one big advantage to Razer's version is that instead of having to manually configure your acceleration curve yourself like you have to do in raw Excel, which involves a lot of trial and error, you can just use predefined profiles Razer created with pros, or you can build your own custom curve. And next we have my favorite feature that I've talked about many times before, the center tilt feature, which has the same 44-degree range as the FP235K sensor we saw in the Viper V3 Pro. This feature is super useful for people like myself who use a tilted grip and want movements to be even and not slanted, and Razer even has a tool built in here you can use to find your ideal angle for your aim style, and with this tool I found I have a -6-degree tilt with my angled grip, and as I mentioned earlier in this video, I did utilize a -6-degree tilt on my Deathadder throughout my testing, and after taking a day or two for my aim to get accustomed to the tilt actually felt really great to use and made my in-game movements much more natural. Synapse 4 also has a bunch of other of the expected features such as a battery readout, links to the mouse's user manual, a features guide, and easy access to the mouse's serial number and firmware version, and of course support, all of which are great features. And there's also the same plugin features such as the profile migration, a macro editor, and a new feature called Exchange, which are essentially fancy macros tied to AI tasks or system tasks. But one odd downside to the Deathadder V4 Pro, just like the Viper V3 Pro, is that unlike most mice which support multiple onboard profiles, the mouse only supports one, which is auto-configured by your last used settings in Synapse. And while you can add additional profiles, they're stored in Synapse, not the mouse itself, so if you plan on using multiple profiles on your Deathadder or any of other Razer's mice for that matter, Synapse will need to run in the background to support the extra profiles, as again they're not stored on the mouse itself. But as I said when I previously talked about Synapse 4, while it does have a lot of great features, there are definitely some issues with it, as firstly Synapse 4 is very bloated, with so much extra stuff packed inside this version that users like myself will never use. Again, it reminds me a lot of ASUS's Armoury Crate software, which also also had an insane amount of unnecessary extras packed inside it, but ASUS, unlike Razer, realized that their software was a little bloaty and now offers a slimmed down version of it called Armory Crate Gear that cuts out all the extras and only supports the mouse related features as a standalone program. But sadly, Razer doesn't offer any kind of alternative to Synapse, so if you have a Razer mouse, you are stuck using the very bloated Synapse 4. But there is a very easy way for Razer to address their software woes, as they could release a web-based version of Synapse. This would not only fix the bloatiness of Synapse as it would run through a web browser, it would also make it much lighter and easier to use, and it would have the benefit of being web-based, which is accessible on all systems. And seeing as many mice released by Razer's competitors, namely Ponage, Pulsar, and Ujutsu, and many other brands, already have web drivers for their mice, it'd be nice to see Razer offer one as well. Next, let's talk about one of my favorite aspects of the Deathadder V4 Pro, its repairability. As I mentioned earlier, the mouse's internal build and design is very impressive, and the internal cage-like structure helps to keep the upper shell very rigid and allows the mouse to be decently serviceable. However, as we've seen for every Razer mouse to date, the base axis screws you need to remove to disconnect the top and base shells are Torx screws, so you will need a special bit to open the mouse, but once inside, the mouse uses just standard Phillips head screws for the remainder of the internal components. And once inside, with the central cage-like structure removed, you can access or service pretty much every component inside the mouse, with the exception of the side buttons, as they're on their own separate PCB that's affixed to the central cage-like structure, as well as the top shell main buttons and side buttons as we talked about earlier, as they are anchored to the top shell. And as I mentioned earlier, the new Gen 4 main click switches are hot swappable, however they do use a different pin design than the Gen 3 switches, so they aren't backwards compatible, but I assume they'll be forward compatible with Razer's future switch types. And of course, I will highlight again here that the pull tab for the batteries adhesive is an amazing feature, and I hope we see this on more brands in the future. But if you want to learn more about how to fully disassemble and reassemble the Deathadder V4 Pro, learn more about its internal design, component weights, and more, get subscribed so you don't miss the Deathadder V4 Pro's teardown video, as well as the teardown of the updated Hyperspeed Gen 2 dongle. Now let's talk about the Deathadder V4 Pro's stock skates, which as I mentioned earlier are surprisingly good, as instead of having a very speed optimized performance profile like the Deathadder V3's original stock skates, they offer a more controlled and balanced glide, which in combined with their surface area makes these stock skates feel and perform incredibly well for stock skates, that is. Now these skates are the same type we saw used on the Viper V3 Pro, being 100% PTFE skates with the same layering underneath them, but the ones here have been adjusted to make them smaller than the Viper V3 Pro stock skates, which result in these skates feeling a little faster than the larger Viper skates, but they're still much more controlled than the original Deathadder V3 stock skates. Another notable improvement is their shaping, as they're cut much better, as there isn't that much of a gap between the skates and the skate cutouts as there was in the Viper V3 Pro, but they're still not perfectly sized, as there is still a small gap on the skate's base here, but since my unit is a pre-release unit, I assume the skate sizing will be fixed on the final retail batches. But while the stock skates perform really well here, one disappointing aspect about them is that there is still no skate removal ramps installed on the mouse's base, which makes removing the stock skates very difficult, and due to their 100% PTFE nature, while the skates are usable on glass, I wouldn't recommend using them there as their material will wear very quickly. However, for other pad material types, the stock skates will have their expected lifespan and their fantastic performance. But all that said, I still think given the Deathadder V4 Pro's premium price, it absolutely should include extra skates, as the mouse only including one pre-installed set is quite disappointing. I'd also love to see additional skate types included, perhaps a dot version of the same type or a hard pad optimized dot skate, as many other brands such as Pulsar include a variety of skate shapes and types with their mice. So overall, just as I said with the Viper V3 Pro stock skates, the Deathadder V4 Pro stock skates are extremely good and are without a doubt the best stock skates I've ever used to date, and they perform so well. In fact, I didn't find the need to use aftermarket skates here over my testing, as the stock skates are so good. And I'm very glad to see that Razer is using them going forward, and hopefully we'll see them continue to use them on their future mice. But again, I would like to see them be cut properly so they properly fill the mouse's channels. I would like to see skate removal ramps added and additional sets or types included as well, given the mouse's more premium price tag. And lastly, we have the Deathadder V4 Pro's stock cable, which as I mentioned earlier is unfortunately quite disappointing, just like the Viper V3 Pro's stock cable. Now this cable is the typical USB A to C type, which does come with protective rubber caps for both ends and a cable tie. However, the cable is weirdly rigid, much more so than I expected. The wrapping is fine, being a standard semi-rough paracord wrapping, but the cable lacks a tilted USB-C end. However, one positive to the cable is that despite its thickness, the cable is still compatible with mel sponges, which does improve the wired usage a little bit. Now this cable type is particularly surprising as the cable on the Deathadder V3 wired was fantastic. It was a little rough in its texturing and it did lack a tilted USB-C end, but the cable was very light and super flexible, so the cable felt weightless. This cable however feels like an anchor and heavily hinders the Deathadder V4 Pro's wired experience, making utilize the dual AK pulling less than ideal, and as such I'd highly recommend using an aftermarket cable for wired use here with the Deathadder, such as a Pulsar stock cable or just any cable that's light, flexible, and has a tilted USB-C end. So just like we saw in the Viper V3 Pro, the Deathadder stock cable is definitely a weak point here, which is especially disappointing considering Razer is still advertising its mouse as a premium esports optimized mouse, and given that advertisement, you'd think they'd include a more flexible cable similar to the Deathadder V3's wired cable. That way the usage experience between wired and wireless would be similar enough that if you forgot to charge your mouse, you could use it wired without any significant performance impacts, but sadly that's not the case here as the cable does heavily impact the Deathadder V4 Pro's wired usage. As such, I'd love to see Razer upgrade the stock cable not only on the Deathadder V4 Pro but all of their mice for that matter, including their future ones, to a stock cable more similar to the one that was used on the Deathadder V3 wired but with a tilted USB-C end. That type of cable would be a significant improvement as it would allow the mouse to be used wired without any performance impacts, and it would make the usage experience for not only the Deathadder V4 Pro but also Razer's future mice that support dual AK much better than it currently is with this heavy rigid stock cable. Also, as a reminder, if you do use the mouse wired, since the stock cable is a more rigid, heavier type, it does make the Deathadder V4 Pro ever so slightly forward heavy, but not in a way that negatively impacts the mouse's performance. Alrighty, well in closing, overall I am very impressed with the Razer Deathadder V4 Pro. I know I have a long history with the Deathadder shape, but that aside, the various improvements Razer has made here are fantastic upgrades, and just to name a few, the support for dual AK Hertz polling, the updated Hyperspeed Dongle, the updated sensor, and several amazing performance features such as sensor tilt, dynamic sensitivity, and smart tracking. The new MCU is also a standout upgrade, as are the new main click switches and scroll wheel encoder. Sure, the mouse still has some issues, as its accessories are quite disappointing, particularly the included grips. The stock skates, while they are very good, are limited to a single pre-installed set, and the mouse doesn't include alternative shapes or types for other pad types. The mouse also lacks skate removal ramps, which is very disappointing, and the stock cable is just as bad as the Viper V3 Pro stock cable, which makes utilizing the wired 8K Hertz polling quite difficult. The main clicks also should be a little more walled in by the top shell to prevent any chance of interference from fingers, and the optical encoder could be a little more controlled, and of course Synapse 4 is still very bloated. But despite these flaws, as I mentioned at the top of this video, I see this mouse as a statement piece, as by releasing this mouse, Razer has not only reclaimed their crown for the best ergonomic mouse you can currently buy, they've also thrown down the gauntlet daring the competition to try and compete with the Deathadder V4 Pro, and as we discussed in this video, considering there has been such a drastic jump in terms of tech and performance, I don't see anyone competing with the Deathadder anytime soon, even if other brands get their hands on the new Nordic MCUs. But who knows, maybe we'll see another brand surprise us and dethrone the Deathadder, but for now, in my opinion, Razer holds the crown as the Deathadder V4 Pro is a good f***ing mouse, and it is the best ergonomic mouse you can buy on the market, even despite its flaws. But now that the dust has settled, so to speak, and Razer has reclaimed their ergonomic crown, I have a feeling Razer's going to go ahead and set their sights on reclaiming their crown in the symmetrical market next, and they might do that with ease, as a theoretical Viper V4 Pro with the same performance specs here as the Deathadder V4 with some other improvements to the accessories and some other various changes would be an extremely solid mouse, but we'll have to wait and see what the Viper V4 Pro ends up being like, and we'll have to see if Razer can reclaim their crown in the symmetrical market, but that'll be a video for another time. But with that, that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you for watching. I know these Razer videos are always on the long side, but I hope you all found the video informative and helpful, and don't forget I have a full teardown guide for the Deathadder V4 Pro and the new Gen 2 to Hyperspeed Dongle releasing soon, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss those videos. Big thanks again to Razer for sending over the Deathadder V4 Pro early for review, I greatly appreciate it, and big thank you to all of our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you'd like to support my efforts with these in-depth reviews and of course the Teardown project, please consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a channel member also gives you early access to all upcoming content, so if you want to support what I do here, consider becoming a channel member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the RAZER Deathadder V4 Pro, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.